Right, so very happy to have this conversation today with you, Donald Robertson. So this is part of this collaboration between your podcast and the Breakthrough Press podcast from our new student publication that was launched here last week at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. For some of our listeners who might not know who you are, Donald Robertson is a cognitive behavioural psychotherapist, author, and trainer. Donald, you are the author of 7 books on philosophy and psychotherapy, including How to Think Like a Roman Emperor and the more recent Verissimus, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. Could you, first of all, give us a brief definition of what Stoicism is and what it stands for?
Well, first of all, let me say it's a pleasure to be here speaking to you today, especially because of the Scottish connection. So I'll give you 2 answers to your question. One is, what is Stoicism historically? And then what does Stoicism teach? So Stoicism is a school of Greek philosophy, kind of, although it was actually founded by a Phoenician immigrant to Athens in 301 BC called Zeno of Citium. He came from the island of Cyprus originally. And it's related to the earlier philosophy of Socrates, which it draws on pretty heavily. And so it's part of the Socratic tradition in Western philosophy. And it survived as an ancient school of philosophy for about 500 years. It's a pretty long time. Most of the writings that we have come from later Stoics in the Roman Empire, basically. And the writings of the earlier Stoics are largely lost apart from fragments. So I'll just mention some names because your listeners might have heard of them. The main Stoics whose writings survive are Seneca, who's kind of topical at the moment because the trailer just came out a few days ago for the movie Seneca, starring John Malkovich, that's about his life and his relationship with Emperor Nero. Seneca was an advisor and a speechwriter for Emperor Nero. We have many letters from him. Then there's Epictetus, who was arguably the most important teacher of philosophy in Roman history, arguably, certainly one of the most important. And we have many discourses of his that were written down actually by one of his students. And then there's the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who is very famous. He was portrayed by Richard Harris in the first act of the movie Gladiator, featuring Russell Crowe. Actually, funnily enough, there's another movie coming out, Gladiator 2, has been written and is in the process of being written at the moment. It's been greenlit by the studio. So maybe we'll hear a little bit more about Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius when that movie comes out as well. And then also a kind of honourable mention goes to Cicero, who was not a Stoic, but is one of our main sources for Stoicism. He's a very educated man, a Roman statesman, one of the most important orators in history. And he'd studied Stoicism, although he followed the academic school of philosophy, a rival school of philosophy. So a lot of the information that we have about Stoicism comes from Cicero. So that's a potted history of Stoicism. And then what does Stoicism teach? Stoicism, first and foremost, is a virtue ethic. And it was a big philosophy that taught many different things because it spanned 500 years and many people contributed to it. But the essence of the philosophy is that virtue is the only true good, and virtue is understood as a character trait and actually a form of wisdom, a form of knowledge or moral wisdom. And the Stoics consider that to be the only absolutely intrinsically good thing in life, and everything else in life has value, but it's of secondary value or derivative value compared to our supreme goal, which is to develop reason and wisdom in daily life. Now, that's the core of the philosophy. The core of the philosophy is an ethic, but it has an obvious psychological implication. So if you imagine someone who really genuinely believed that their own character was the most important thing in life and other things were only of secondary value. So, for example, wealth and reputation are not intrinsically valuable. What matters is how you use them, whether you use them wisely or foolishly. That person, you would think, would be more emotionally resilient. because if they lost their wealth or their reputation was damaged, it wouldn't be the end of the world to them. What would matter more to them would be how they responded to that. And that's part of the legacy of Stoicism. It left us with some writings and ideas that are obviously very relevant today and people are drawn to because they offer the promise of greater psychological resilience in the face of adversity. And so the word Stoicism has almost kind of become synonymous with resilience in many people's minds. But underlying that is actually a big philosophy that has a set of moral values, an ethical worldview at its core.
So about the psychological aspect of it, if we come to what you've been studying as well in the past years, what is cognitive behavioral therapy and how does this differ from applying Stoic principles to one's life?
Well, cognitive behavioral therapy evolved out of behavior, an earlier approach called behavior therapy. And it really didn't really become prominent in the mainstream until around about the 1980s, actually, although it began developing in the late 1950s, somewhat earlier. And cognitive behavioral therapy evolved partly out of disillusionment with earlier psychotherapy approaches, like Freudian psychoanalysis and its derivatives. And it was based on emerging research on the emotions in the field of psychology. And cognitive behavioral therapy revolved around a cognitive model of emotion that says that our feelings, particularly problematic emotions like anger, depression, anxiety, are shaped to a large extent by our underlying beliefs and our patterns of thinking. And the pioneers of cognitive therapy realized that the Stoics had said something very similar to this 2,500 years earlier. And indeed, these ideas go all the way back to Socrates and beyond. So Albert Ellis, who was one of the earliest pioneers of cognitive therapy, he was a New York psychotherapist. In the 1950s, Ellis was a psychoanalytic therapist originally, but became disillusioned with a more post-Freudian approach. And he decided to kind of, set aside all his Freudian books, all his psychoanalytic books, and start again from scratch in the middle of his career. And he thought, I'm going to begin again and figure out a more down-to-earth, common sense kind of approach to psychotherapy. And for inspiration, he looked to the Stoics, whom he'd read as a teenager. And he, in order to explain the cognitive model of emotion to his clients, so psychotherapists often have to take quite complex state-of-the-art research and put it into plain English in a way that, a 15-year-old kid could understand, or an old lady could understand, or a bus driver could understand, or, whoever happens to walk into your consulting room. You have to make it relatable and relevant and understandable to the man on the Clapham omnibus, as we say, any random person. And so Ellis found himself quoting Epictetus. He said, it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. There's a quote from a famous book called The Enchiridion of Epictetus, and it's central to Stoic psychology or psychotherapy, if you like. And Ellis just found that people understood that quote and they remembered it, although it happened to kind of encapsulate pretty much what the research was saying about the cognitive appraisal, cognitive model of emotions. And so Ellis taught that quote to all of his clients, and he saw many thousands of clients, all of his students, and he mentions it in most of the books that he wrote. So by the time I started training in CBT, it was already a kind of cliche among cognitive therapists to say this. And I thought, wow, cognitive therapists must be really into Stoicism, right? My first degree was in philosophy, and then I got into training in counselling and therapy. And it came as a bit of a surprise to me to find that that was the only quote from Stoicism that most CBT practitioners or cognitive therapists knew about. And I became doubly surprised when I dug deeper into Stoicism and I realised Stoicism already had an approach to psychotherapy, because we tend to think of psychotherapy as a very modern thing. But it's not actually. It's in a sense one of the oldest disciplines in Western society. Not just that ancient authors kind of imply psychotherapy ideas, but they explicitly talk about a therapy of the psyche. And they wrote books on psychological therapy. For instance, the third head of the Stoic school, Chrysippus, who was one of the greatest intellectuals of the ancient world, wrote a book called On Therapeutics, which is about Stoic psychotherapy, which is lost today. We only have fragments from it. But we have an entire book by Marcus Aurelius' physician, Galen, who is another polymath from the ancient world. And Galen wasn't a Stoic, but he'd read the Stoic books on psychotherapy, and he wrote a book called On the Diagnosis and Cure of the Soul's Passions, which is clearly a book about philosophical therapy. And so this was a familiar idea in the ancient world. They call it therapia, therapy of the psyche. And I thought, these CBT practitioners know this quote. It's really important to them. They teach it to all their clients. So it's really surprising that they haven't made more use of all the other therapy stuff that exists in Stoicism. And that inspired me really to begin writing about it and talking about it. You know, like anyone that comes up with a cool idea like that, something that get excited about it, your first reaction is it just me? Like, am I the only person that thinks this is interesting? So luckily I was doing training and workshops, and I trained therapists in the UK. So I would be standing regularly in front all day long in front of 30, 40, 50 psychiatrists, psychologists, counsellors, life coaches, therapists, talking all day to them. And I'd talk to them about Stoicism, and I'd be like, is it just me? Like, do you guys think this is cool? And they wanted to hear more and more and more about it. So I thought, it's strange that there aren't more books written about Stoicism for modern therapists. So I wrote one called The Philosophy of Cognitive-Behavioural Therapy. I wrote it almost 15 years ago, I think. It was 12, maybe 13 years ago. And then, that kind of launched me into being an author, I suppose. And I've written more and more books since then. And Stoicism at that time, and I kind of hate having to say this because it sounds like when people say, I was into this band before they were cool or something like that. But when I first got into Stoicism, no one was interested in it. It was, my friends told me it's a real niche subject. It's sort of obscure. People, undergraduate philosophy students, don't normally study Stoicism. I didn't study it in my I studied Plato and Aristotle, but not the Stoics, until after I graduated. I began to read them more. And it was only really within a few years of that more popular books began appearing, like Ryan Holiday's The Obstacle is the Way and William Irvine's Guide to the Good Life. And then my own books came out. And now Stoicism is, as the young people say, a thing, particularly in some parts of the world. I spend a lot of time going between Canada and Athens, and in Greece, still to this day, there's not that much interest in Stoicism, surprisingly. But in Toronto, in Canada, like, I go and get my hair cut, and the barber will say, "What are you doing today?" And I'll say, "Oh, I'm working on a book." And he'll say, "What's it about?" And I'll say, "It's about Marcus Aurelius or whatever." And he'll say, "Oh, I've got a Marcus Aurelius tattoo or something," right? It's kind of everywhere. And these films that we mentioned that are coming out are probably just going to fuel that even more. So that's how I became interested both in Stoicism and in cognitive behavioural therapy.
So could you tell us a bit more about your Scottish background and if that specifically had an influence on the path you chose and your present research?
I think it did, but maybe in a kind of surprising way. So my Scottish background is that I am Scottish, as people might guess. Although I haven't lived in Scotland for a really long time. Like, I moved to England and then I moved to Canada. Like I say, I spend a lot of time in Greece now. I go back to Scotland occasionally. My family are Scottish. I was born in Scotland. I was born in Ayr, and I grew up in Ayrshire on the west coast of Scotland. I went to university in Aberdeen, which is where I studied philosophy. Now, Scotland influenced me, I guess, in a surprising way, because Ayrshire is Burns country. And when I grew up, I kind of got exposed to the poetry of Rabbie Burns. And I didn't think much of it as a kid. I just thought, oh, geez, this is what all the old people are into. Like, my friends' parents and stuff are into Rabbie Burns. And, when you're a kid, it's kind of like old stuff. It's corny or whatever. But I read it. I became familiar with it. And I gradually noticed there were bits of philosophy in Rabbie Burns. He's got a poem called Contented with Little, for example, that pretty much sounds like it could have been written by an Epicurean or a Stoic philosopher. And I think that may be because Burns is influenced partly by philosophical themes in probably Latin poetry that he'd maybe read as a youth, and it sort of kind of filters down into his writing. He says in Tam O'Shanter, his most famous poem, pleasures are like poppies spread, you seize the flower, its bloom is shed, or like the snow falls in the river, a moment white, then melts forever. So there are themes of transience are common in poetry. These tropes find their way into Rabbie Burns, and that was the bits of Burns that I was interested in, and it kind of stuck with me. And then later, this is a bit of trivia for you, I guess, that I realized, I thought, did Burns know anything about the Stoics? And I realized that Burns was quite good friends with a professor of philosophy in Glasgow, I believe, called Dugald Stewart, who was, as many people during the Scottish Enlightenment, funnily enough, was really into Stoicism. Adam Smith was hugely into Stoicism as well. And a number of other eminent Scottish academics during the Enlightenment period were big fans of Stoicism. And Dugald Stewart, in particular, wrote very favourably in detail about Stoicism as a philosophy of life. And so I wonder if Burns maybe heard about Stoic philosophy in bits and pieces from some of his friends and acquaintances. But he would have picked up similar ideas from ancient poetry. And so I was kind of immersed in that as a kid in Scottish culture. Not so much from Scottish religion and theology, but more from the poetry. And then when I began reading the Stoics, it seemed kind of strangely familiar to me in a way, because I guess this is where I picked up this influence from.
Do you think that by approaching things from a practical point of view, Stoicism is helping, especially younger people, to access ideas and values that might sometimes seem a bit unattractive when they're presented by conventional psychology? For instance, why isn't CBT as popular as Stoicism on social media?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was looking at some of the leading pioneers of CBT research don't really have a big social media presence. It surprises me in a way, but Stoicism is big. When I wrote my book on Stoicism and CBT, it was aimed for psychotherapists and academics to read. That's who I assume my audience was. It was an academic publication, not a trade publication. And, I think this came as a shock to my publisher, but psychologists and therapists and philosophers didn't read my book. So it should have been a failure in that sense. But it sold quite well because laypersons read it, like ordinary people, non-academics, non-professionals read it, and it became kind of a self-help book, which wasn't what it was meant to be, which is kind of sums it up in a nutshell. And so for a long time, I felt a little bit disappointed because I thought all these other cognitive therapists are going to get really into Stoicism, and some of my students did, but it didn't really kind of catch fire in the way that I thought it would. I was always puzzled by that. And only recently I've started to find more and more cognitive therapists getting into Stoicism. And I think my explanation of that, by the way, is that twofold. Cognitive therapists are very busy and they have to read a lot of research. So I think partly they feel that they don't have that much time to really get in depth into philosophy if it's not something that they've studied. And also they have it drummed into them that everything they do has to be evidence-based. And so it's always even older stuff like Ellis's rational emotive behaviour therapy, they'll often distance themselves from because it seems dated to them, and they want to mainly focus on what the current research, certainly in the UK, what the current research is saying. So they've got a little bit of a natural, their values are a little bit opposed to drawing on something as old as Stoicism. But as CBT gradually started to be more influenced by mindfulness practices in Buddhism, it became a little bit more open to philosophy and religion and ancient literature. And so now I find that more CBT practitioners are asking about it. And I think that's driven in a roundabout way, interestingly, by their clients. So off of their own initiative, the therapist didn't go and read the Stoics, but they found that clients were turning up to sessions saying, hey, have you read Ryan Holiday or Massimo Pilucci? I was watching this podcast about Stoicism, and it sounds really similar to all the stuff that you're teaching me about CBT. And so the therapist almost kind of gets embarrassed into thinking, oh, geez, I better go and read some books on Stoicism. And I kind of feel like that's how it's happened, which is kind of cool in a way. In terms of the popularity, I like to say, I mentioned this a moment ago about tattoos, but I've never met anyone. And you guys, I'll put this out as a challenge. I always throw the gauntlet down over this, and I've never been proven wrong yet. I've never met anyone that has a CBT tattoo. Like, I've never met anyone that has Albert Ellis's face tattooed on them, or Aaron Beck, or a quote from the books or anything like that. But you wouldn't believe how many people have sent me pictures of their Stoicism tattoos. There's a couple of people that have got whole like Pinterest pages and websites with collections of photos of Stoic tattoos on them, right? Ryan Holiday has a Stoic tattoo. So do I. I think Massimo has one as well, right? Now, this might seem like a bit of a weird, silly observation, but it's quite serious because people get into Stoicism in a way that they don't get into CBT. CBT is meant to be short-term. Like, you go, you do it, you learn some skills, either you get better or you don't, and then it's pretty much over. You know, there's a bit more to it than that. You're meant to maintain your improvement over the long term, but CBT does not proffer itself as a philosophy of life. CBT is not a yoga, not as normally understood. But Stoicism is a philosophy of life. It's like a Western yoga or a Western Buddhism. And so people identify with it at a deeper, lifelong level. It's part of how they see themselves. Like they say, I'm a Buddhist or I'm a Stoic. Like, and CBT, for a number of reasons, cannot and does not present itself as doing that. But nevertheless, it's very closely aligned with a philosophy that can offer to provide people with a whole worldview and a permanent movement with which they might align themselves or identify themselves. And that's why they go and get a tattoo or a T-shirt or whatever, you know, but they wouldn't think of doing that with CBT. By the way, another observation I'd make about this that I made right at the beginning when I began writing about this subject is that people read books on CBT and then they usually don't reread them that much. So they'll read Feeling Good by David Burns or Russ Harris's The Happiness Trap, and these are great books and they're best-selling books. But people don't keep reading them every year. They don't quote them from memory that much. Whereas Meditations of Marcus Aurelius in particular, people read over and over again. They have favourite quotations from it. And it's partly because it's beautifully written. Only less than 1% of Stoic writing survive today. And it's the creme de la creme, in a sense, that survives. History has curated the most memorable and best written. I think people underestimate a couple of things about the ancient Stoics. Some of the other books that are lost, we have fragments of, and they're kind of a little bit dry by comparison, right? Not all the ancient Stoics were great writers. Seneca was a celebrity writer during his lifetime. He was an expert on rhetoric. His father was a rhetoric professor. He was a professional speechwriter. So it's no coincidence that people like to quote him and that his writings are survived for thousands of years. Marcus Aurelius, although he was a Roman emperor, studied rhetoric for decades in Greek and Latin under the two leading rhetoricians of his era. So Marcus was a highly experienced, highly skilled, very thoroughly trained writer. Although the book we have by him is lots of little fragments, he was capable of writing very elaborate speeches and very skilled at it. So again, it's no coincidence that people find him so quotable. Like, he's had decades of training. And even Epictetus was not a rhetorician, but Epictetus wrote nothing. The discourses of Epictetus and Enchiridion were written by one of his students called Arrian, who was a highly accomplished Roman statesman, military commander, and writer, a very prolific writer. So again, like it would be like if Shakespeare wrote a book on CBT. You know, we have these literary classics, and so people love them and identify with them, and the quotes remain with them for the rest of their life, which is something that, sadly, until one day we have someone who's both Shakespeare and a CBT practitioner, but that doesn't quite exist. You know, psychologists generally don't produce these writers of the same caliber, like as Seneca, for instance, or Cicero.
How do you think that an approach based on Stoicism could change how we see psychology today and how it might be approached in the future as well?
Well, in a number of ways. So to follow on from what I was saying, psychotherapy, I train psychotherapists, and I've trained and worked in many different modalities of therapy. And usually when you go that deep into a subject and people ask you, what would you do differently or what do you think would change, you'll tend to give an answer that people don't expect, that seems, you know, to kind of cut more deeply towards the heart of things. So rather than moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic, you know, or kind of fiddling around the edges of the subject, I would rip out the guts of psychotherapy and completely change the whole way it works potentially. So psychotherapy is a product of the Industrial Revolution in the sense that the idea that someone would train as a therapist and then just like sit in a consulting room with one client at a time is a kind of artifact in a way. It's not necessarily the best way to do therapy with people. It's just the way that the profession has evolved over time. And one of the limitations of it that seems glaringly obvious is that everyone knows in medicine in general, prevention is better than cure. But psychotherapy is remedial, not preventative. Like, you wait until someone is depressed and then they go and see a therapist normally, or until their phobia becomes unbearable and then they go and see a therapist. And clearly it would be better if we had the preventative approach to mental health. And therapy is also almost untenably expensive. To pay for someone to spend many hours one-to-one with a client, especially as mental health problems are an epidemic today, it's not really viable. And the NHS, for example, realises that. That's why more funding has gone into online courses, the use of self-help, group therapy, because they're more financially viable. It's never going to be viable to pay for one-to-one individual sessions for everybody in the country, basically, you know. It's just not really a realistic model. But if we could work with groups, if we could use more self-help and online approaches, use audio recordings and videos more, and adopt a more preventative approach, that would be what I like to call the holy grail of mental health. That prevention is better than cure. Now, Stoicism potentially offers a more preventative, long-term alternative to CBT. And that's partly, like I said earlier, about the fact that people memorize Stoic literature because it's more, the writing quality is better, it's better quality, they quote it all the time. It's because it provides a whole framework, so they identify with it like it's their yoga or their Buddhism. And so because they identify with it, it becomes more of a permanent fixture in their life. We know that one of the problems in CBT is, especially if you teach people particular skills, they'll often use those skills for months, maybe years, but then they stop using them eventually and potentially just kind of relapse into bad habits. So to train people in psychological resilience based on CBT, the challenge is making it sticky or permanent. Otherwise, you have to keep doing booster sessions every year, every 2 years to keep the skills fresh. But Stoicism seems like it holds out the promise of something that would change their character, change their outlook in a more lasting way. And I think one reason for that is that because of the way that therapy works as a profession, you normally have a therapist in a room with a client, and they have to operate within certain boundaries. So therapists must not indoctrinate clients into particular moral values, right? And that makes perfect sense. We have to be very careful to maintain neutrality. But I always thought there's a paradox about that, because maybe it's the client's values that are actually the root cause, in a sense, of many of their problems. So, for instance, I specialised in treating social anxiety. So when we work with clients with social anxiety, we might be working at the level of assumptions they have about their appearance, assumptions they make about what other people are thinking of them, patterns of thinking that they're engaged in, even the way they focus their attention or behave in a social situation. But it struck me that in order to feel social anxiety, to a large extent, you have to care very strongly about what other people think of you. And I noticed that some people just don't care that much about other people's opinions of them, or not in the same way. And as I was reading the Stoics, I noticed the Stoics' way of addressing this was to say, why should you place more value on other people's opinions of you than you do upon your own opinion about your behaviour? Or, at the very least, why place so much value on the opinion of people who you don't respect? If you're going to place value on other people's opinions, why not identify people who you believe exhibit wisdom and focus on their opinion of you, rather than people that you think are foolish and be upset about their opinion of you? Shouldn't you be more selective about the opinions that you place such value on? But that's really digging deeper and getting to the level of somebody's underlying value system, and maybe even what you could call a kind of meta-ethical view about, are any external events, should any external events be assigned that kind of value or that much value, especially relative to our way of coping or our attitude towards them? Should there be more value placed on someone else's opinion of me than I place on my own ability to cope with social situations, for instance? Maybe the way that I deal with situations, whether I deal well or badly or wisely or foolishly with them, is more important than the outcome. If I make a mistake, for example, or whether people praise me or criticize me. So that doesn't mean that those feedback, incidentally, is completely irrelevant. It just means that we shouldn't be upset about it, or catastrophize about it, or be depressed about it. We should be able to take it on board and care about things without getting highly upset about them, perhaps. Now, you can instill values like that, arguably, in a normal therapy session, or certainly it's a grey area. It's a problem for therapy. Therapists increasingly now do work with clients' values. They didn't work so much with them in the past. Now they do work more explicitly with values, but it raises some challenges for them. Interestingly, I saw an article recently by a guy who was a philosophy professor who had CBT, and he really struggled with the way that the CBT practitioner was doing values clarification with him, because he thought it was very philosophically naive, right? It's kind of like teaching your grandma how to suck eggs. This guy was an expert on ethics, and it was like this therapist's idea about values is just like making him roll his eyes or whatever. But if values are really that important in terms of shaping our emotions, and it seemed obvious to me that they were, maybe philosophy is in a better position to help us think them through and address them. Now, Stoicism does actually advocate for a particular set of values, it has to be said, but they're values that are to be accepted on the basis of reason, not on the basis of faith. So Stoicism doesn't say you must accept these values. It simply says you should think about your values, and if you do, you may arrive at the same conclusion that we do. These are the conclusions that we've arrived at about the nature of values and the type of values that are most important. So if Stoicism can address values, I think that's partly why it's able to transform us at a deeper level and a more permanent level. If that's true, CBT may be confined to operating at a sense a cognitively more superficial level to some extent.
Even though books written by Stoics, such as Meditations that you mentioned by Marcus Aurelius, have been studied and used for many years by leaders or even soldiers in the trenches during the First World War, what makes them particularly relevant to our era now and to crises that we're going through, such as pandemics, the cost of living crisis, or dealing with wars in an unstable geopolitical context, for instance?
Well, let me back up and talk about something real. It's going to seem really simple and really fundamental, and then I'll expand from there. Again, this time goes on as I get more long in the tooth. In some ways, the way I look at things seems more fundamental to me, but also in a sense seems simpler. I think often people don't see the wood for the trees when they're looking at something as complex as an ancient philosophy. One of the fundamental concepts in all Greek philosophy, certainly in Socrates and in the Stoics, so fundamental, so basic, is the distinction between appearance and reality. So the early Greek thinkers realized that appearances can be misleading. And they were very concerned with this. The natural philosophers believed that often people were confused about the way that natural phenomena like earthquakes happen or solar eclipses happen. And they tried to get beyond the appearances to a deeper understanding of what was actually happening in nature. And this idea that appearances frequently mislead us, and that reason is the tool that we need to use to get under appearances or behind them, became integral to all philosophy, not just in studying nature, but in studying man and studying ethics as well, and studying psychology. And one of the areas where Socrates is believed to have innovated is that he initially studied natural philosophy but became disillusioned with it, and people say it was Socrates that introduced the focus on ethics. Other people talked about ethics, but Socrates is known for really being the first person to systematically apply the dialectical method to ethical questions, and particularly questions concerning the nature of virtue. So in that area, appearance and reality is again an important distinction, because, for example, in many different ways, but for example, someone might appear to be your friend, but if you dig deeper, you might realize that they're behaving like an enemy in reality. If you try to help other people, you might realize, as many parents do and teachers do, that what appears to be helping other people might actually be harming them, like if you think more deeply about it. And what appears at first to be harmful might actually be beneficial on reflection, often when you think about the longer term consequences. So the classic example in the ancient world was if you go to a physician and you have surgery that's painful, like let's say dentistry is a good example. You have to get a tooth yanked out in the ancient world. Now that seems bad, because it's painful. But actually maybe in the longer term it's going to alleviate you from more suffering. So is it a cause of suffering, or is it a cause of alleviating suffering? It appears at first glance superficially to be a painful and bad thing, but in closer inspection we endure what appears painful or appears harmful because we believe that longer term it's actually going to be in our interests, it's going to benefit us. Now Socrates thought this is a good approach, we can do this over and over again in many different areas of life. Looking more deeply beyond appearances. But very quickly he realized there was a category of individuals who were doing something quite contrary to this, and actually using the misleading power of appearance, using the misleading power of passions, feelings, pleasures, and pains to manipulate large groups of people. And those people, during Socrates' lifetime, assumed the title of sophist, wise man, or expert. and they were some of the richest people in the ancient world. They became extremely wealthy as celebrity speakers, and they used rhetoric and persuasion skills to manipulate the emotions, to instill fear and anger and other strong emotions in their audience in order to manipulate them by using the power of appearance, by using emotions. And Socrates thought often that what the sophists are saying isn't really true. And sometimes they're encouraging people to do things that are foolish rather than wise, because they're working at the level of appearance and persuasion. And I thought that was really interesting stuff when you're reading Socrates, when you're reading the Stoics. During Socrates' lifetime, the sophists were very influential, but in the Roman Empire, there was a resurgence of interest in Greek culture, which we call the Second Sophistic. So Greek intellectuals came to Rome, and there was this renaissance of sophistry under the Roman Empire. Hadrian, for example, surrounded himself with sophists and kind of aspired to be one in a sense himself. And then I thought, well, that's all interesting, but, they're all dead, I thought. And then I gradually over time, I realized that they're not. I realized that in the modern world, through social media, we're really bombarded with pretty much the same thing. We're faced with pretty much the same problem that the news media, social media influencers, in a more sophisticated way, are doing the same thing that the sophists were doing. So social media influencers will go on the internet and scour it for controversies that are trending, and then they'll make programs about it. And they won't do any research on whether it's true or false. For example, Alex Jones's lawyer said this recently in court. So I normally kind of be cautious what I attribute to other people, but his own lawyer said that this was his method in court. He didn't do any research on the truth or falsehood of the stories he was reporting. He just looked at how controversial they were and if they were trending. So amplified conspiracy theories and things like that, because he knew that it would get attention. And so social media influencers will say things that upset people and provoke fear and anger because they know it captivates attention and it creates more publicity. And so they make more money as a result of doing that. Same as the sophists in the ancient world. You quickly realize if you're speaking to a large audience of people, if you tell them something that's true but kind of boring, they won't come back. But if you tell them something that's not entirely true, but it makes them really mad and kind of gets them really worked up, then your audience is going to get bigger and bigger. And Socrates thought this is like a drug. You guys are high on the crack of spreading conspiracy theories and, whipping up the audience because you're getting gratification from it. And so once you're hooked into that, you're going to keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And the lies get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the manipulation gets worse and worse and worse. And it's dangerous because the politicians got in the act as well in the ancient world. So I think we're kind of living through the third sophistic in a sense. But they're cyber sophists now. And Socrates was concerned that the ancient orators literally competed against each other. They would give speeches and then have a contest to see who got the biggest round of applause, right? Social media algorithms reward content that gets the most likes or most engagement in the same way. So Socrates would say, it's not, the truth isn't a popularity contest. You guys are just inevitably now going to start adapting what you say to be whatever you think is going to get the biggest reaction from you. So truth has gone out the window completely. You're now just selling out, basically, appealing to your audience's prejudices. Social media works in exactly the same way. So people end up in bubbles, where they're hearing more and more stuff amplifying their existing prejudices. And it's really, the ancient philosophers saw that was an inherently toxic framework. And that, I think, people are fed up with it, right? I think once a situation gets bad enough, even though initially people are duped by it, they gradually start to realize that something's not quite right. I think more and more people now are realizing we're at the stage where people realise that there's something toxic about social media and the news media today, and the network, the way social media influencers sometimes spread news and distort it and conspiracy theories and stuff, the lack of accountability, the lack of research, like, the way that they benefit from hyping up audiences and spreading fear and anger and stuff. But I think we're at a stage where people don't know what to do about it. They think this sucks, but what do we do about it? And, I think that's why they're beginning to turn to Stoicism. They have an inkling that ancient philosophy might be able to help in some way. Now, initially in the ancient world, people were drawn to philosophy because the promise of therapy and resilience. They thought it would help them cope with their distress, and that's why people are drawn to it today. But as they got deeper into philosophy, they realised that philosophy taught them critical thinking skills, they taught logic and dialectic, in ways that could help protect them against persuasion. It taught them common logical fallacies, and it taught them not to use fallacies like the rhetoricians do, but to be able to see through them, like to disarm the enemy, basically, to disarm the sophists, like by understanding their tricks and so on. And I think we're not at that stage yet. But I hope that people that are drawn to Stoicism and other ancient philosophy because of its therapeutic value will dig deeper into it and begin to appreciate the role of dialectic in ancient philosophy as another type of preventative, as something that could potentially inoculate us against the baneful effects of sophistry and social media.
Could you remind us of the main Stoic principles, and where do you think they can be found today in modern times? Could you think of specific examples from public figures or groups, maybe groups of people displaying the use of Stoic values today?
I don't find it easy to identify public figures who exemplify Stoicism, for the simple reason that many people who are prominent in public life are more like the sophists. People rise to fame partly because they cultivate a public image and things like that. So it's not the best place to look for Stoics, funnily enough. If I was people used to ask me, who's a good example of a famous politician that's a Stoic and things like that. And that question troubled me. And then I realised, actually, the best thing to do is to explain why I find that a troubling question. And the answer is that, if I'm honest, the people that inspire me the most, that I genuinely think exhibited the most Stoic characteristics, actually were recovering alcoholics or drug addicts that I've met over the course of my life, more like people who had hit rock bottom. Or other people that maybe have been bankrupted or whatever. Specific individuals I can think of are not famous celebrities or politicians, but people who often lived in relative poverty and lived a fairly humble life. I guess arguably like Diogenes the Cynic or Socrates were kind of known for living a more humble lifestyle, and who didn't aspire to be famous, but had maybe even done things that they regret. Actually, in some cases, people that serve time in prison, but people who have radically rethought their values and their outlook on life and transformed themselves. So many drug addicts, alcoholics, and criminals are not transformed in that way, but a small handful of them are. And they come out of it, in my view, stronger, better than people who have never hit rock bottom in their life, and more authentic. They have the air of authenticity often about them, and down-to-earthness that celebrities and gurus lack in many cases. So the truth is, those are the people that I think of. They're anonymous individuals that live on council estates in small towns in Scotland and England, not guys that are all over social media, living $1 million lifestyle, and stuff like that. Most of the guys that are contemporary self-improvement gurus particularly as they become more and more famous, seem to me to resemble the sophists more and more. Mm-hmm. Just as an aside, something that I think I'll mention it because I think it's so important. There's an odd danger to self-help and self-improvement, which is that sometimes self-help advice contains bad psychological advice, just straight up bad advice. And that's an issue. It's kind of hit and miss at times. But there's a deeper and more subtle problem, which is that sometimes the advice is okay, or even maybe good advice, but it's advice in the wrong area. Imagine that your garden shed is burning down, and you're desperately trying to put the fire out with grabbing buckets of water and stuff, right? It's a big deal. It's a catastrophe, right? You've got to your shed is burning down. And I come along and I'm grabbing your arm saying, dude, you need to stop doing that. And you'd say, but the water is helping to put the fire out. And there is a fire here. It's really important that I do something about it. And I say, yeah, but turn around, your whole house is burning down behind you. It'd be more important to put out the fire in your house than to put out the fire in your garden shed, right? And that's what I feel a lot of the self-help and self-improvement discussion online is like. So people are doing genuine self-improvement, therapeutic or self-help stuff, but it's focused in completely the wrong area in many cases. And that's bound to happen, sadly, because when people have psychological problems, they typically have cognitive biases that are blind spots that prevent them from noticing. Now, the biggest one the Stoics realize is anger, right? Anger, by its very nature, is an externalizing emotion. When people feel anxious or depressed, they usually blame themselves. And often they use self-help or they seek therapy. But angry people seldom self-refer for treatment. They're more often referred by their spouse, or in an institution, prison inmates would be referred for anger management, or students in a school, or personnel in the military might be referred by other people for anger management. But people with anger management usually don't, off their own initiative, refer themselves, except in exceptional cases, because the nature of it. Now, suppose you take away therapists and you take away other people and you just have a massive, like today, an explosion of self-help, self-improvement literature online. People with anger problems are going to do every type of self-improvement under the sun except anger management. And I don't think it's any coincidence that what we're seeing are evolving communities based around self-improvement, populated by large numbers of angry young men in particular, who are attracted to sophists or self-improvement gurus who are fueling their anger, often by encouraging them to blame women or minorities or hypothetical bogeymen. So I'm thinking in particular of individuals like Andrew Tate and also to some extent of Jordan Peterson, but a number of other modern self-help gurus who seem to me to be essentially sophists who trade on fueling fear and anger in their audience and then cultivate an audience of people who need therapy more than anyone else, and are getting angrier, instead of getting better. There's something wrong there. It seems, in a sense, it's obviously wrong. Andrew Tate's followers took to the street in Athens a few weeks ago and protested. They were almost rioting in the streets. Why if this is a self-improvement approach, why is it doing nothing for their anger and aggression? Because it's actually feeling it and trading on it, but also because those people know that there's something wrong with their lives, but they can't figure out that the problem is anger. Instead, what they're doing is blaming other people. And so when you're angry and you don't realize that your girlfriend's dumped you because you're bitter and angry and hateful, and that's you've lost your job because you're angry and bitter and irritable and stuff like that. Someone needs to tell you. What people need is a wake-up call. Normally in a therapy setting, the therapist can help by pointing people to their blind spots. But when people aren't in therapy, Like they're just seeking help online. Those blind spots aren't addressed, and they just get bigger and bigger and bigger, until, in extreme cases, you get people in some of these communities actually committing acts of domestic terrorism in the most extreme case. And there's an irony that some of the people recently who have committed horrific acts of domestic terrorism are people who believed that they were members of therapeutic or self-improvement communities. How's that for a paradox? But actually, this has always happened throughout history, in a sense. The sophists, encouraged people often to end up doing quite violent and antisocial things.
Do you feel that there's sort of a clash of different philosophies still to this day? And do you think Stoicism, if it was the prevalent philosophy in today's society, that would be helpful for everyone?
I don't know if it would help everyone, not because I think Stoicism is kind of limited or wrong, but I think the way it's communicated doesn't necessarily appeal to everybody. One of the things the Stoics said was they believed that Stoicism was kind of almost like a perennial philosophy. The Stoics, so Seneca quotes Epicurus, they quote many other philosophers, they quote poets in mythology, because the Stoics believed if our philosophy is right, we can't be the only people that have ever thought of this. So they expected to find fragments of similar ideas everywhere in the culture and in foreign cultures as well. And so they did. They quote myths and poetry and say, this guy's figured out something similar. Of course he has. Because, what we're talking about is real. And if we're confident it's real, we'd expect other people to have noticed it as well. They thought they'd articulated it more clearly and more consistently than other people in their philosophy. But it may be, that some people are more drawn to religion or like Judeo-Christian stuff, or to Buddhism or Hinduism, and I think the Stoics would expect that, and they'd say they're getting their similar ideas maybe. We're kind of in agreement, not on everything, but on some things. They're just finding it in a different tradition that maybe appeals to them a little bit more. Maybe this guy just likes incense, and this other dude, likes Roman gladiators and legionaries and things like that. There's some differences in the philosophy, but maybe they're getting a lot of the same ideas.
If you take the Zen Buddhism, for instance, you find a lot of similarities, I think, with the Stoicism. And then
I think so.
That's one particular religion.
I'll just say something to freak out your audience a little bit. Alexander the Great is to blame for many things. But Alexander the Great, it's like a generation or so before Stoicism was founded, conquered Persia and the north of India. Greeks began to colonize. And so Greek culture spread all through the East. And Alexander reputedly took several philosophers with him. And one was a guy called Pyrrho of Elis, who was the founder of the Greek skeptical philosophy. He also took a Cynic philosopher with him. And we don't know this for sure, but there was contact in the ancient world between East and West. It's pretty limited and intermittent, but it happened. There's one ancient source that claims that Socrates spoke with an Indian merchant, but it's a kind of later source. It's of dubious reliability, but it's plausible. Some people, there are a number of books. There's about 2 or 3 books recently that people have written about the possible connection between Hinduism, Buddhism, and the Western philosophical tradition, running both ways. The most likely candidate is Greek skepticism, that many people have said seems like a Western version of Buddhism and may actually have had some kind of historical connection. And equally in the East, there's evidence that one of the Buddhist scriptures is called the Questions of King Milander, and it's a dialogue between a Buddhist monk and a Hellenistic ruler. So there was some influence of Greek philosophy and culture on Indian religion and philosophy as well. So it's no surprise that these things have similarities. They're not entirely separate traditions. And also, I would say, maybe, and I now add something that's controversial in a different way. When Westerners read Asian philosophy, it seems to me, inevitably translate it into their own cultural norms and concepts. And so I felt, as a young guy, I remember vividly feeling, I studied Buddhism also at university, incidentally, and Hinduism. I studied the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads and the Dhammapada and so on. It really kind of seemed to me that often Westerners were unconsciously drawing on Greek philosophical concepts that they'd kind of like I'd picked up from Rabbi Burns, for example, without even realizing that it was Epicureanism or Stoicism that was kind of filtering down to me. And then I'd read Buddhist stuff and I'd kind of connect it to and translate it. I would maybe, as a young guy, I thought, Jesus, is Rabbi Burns a Buddhist or something? What's all this stuff about impermanence, right? Yeah, that's a good example, right? Pleasures are like poppy spread, you seize the flower, it's blemish. Is this guy Buddhist? This sounds like the Buddhist doctrine of impermanence, right? But I didn't know that was the Heraclitean concept of pantare, like everything flows, and that this concept of impermanence is a central part of European philosophy, and that's probably where Burns got it from. But I think we all, without realizing that we're doing it, translate concepts into ones that we're more familiar with.
Well, thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to add to this conversation?
I think the only thing is I should give a little plug for the Plato's Academy Centre if people are interested. It's the non-profit that I founded. I'm the president of it. It's based in Athens in Greece, and our goal is to build an international conference centre at or adjacent to the original location of Plato's Academy. And we've been up and running for just over a year now. We run virtual events that are free of charge. We've got one coming up pretty soon on how philosophy could restore civility and rationality to political debate. So people might want to check that out because it's a non-profit, it's a philanthropic project, and it's largely what we do is free of charge. We funded by donation. So the website is platosacademy.org. If people want to go there and find out about it and maybe come along to one of our online events.
Do you have anything going on in Scotland at the moment? The Modern Stoic, I think it's the group you created. How does that work, and is it international or not yet?
I was one of the founders of Modern Stoicism, which is an international organisation. The chair originally was Christopher Gill, and the current chair is John Sellers. Are both well-known academics that write about Stoicism. And it runs Stoic Week, which is an annual online e-learning course event. And it runs Stoicon, which is an annual conference, which takes place either online during the pandemic, or it's happened in London and Toronto and New York and Athens, different cities around the world. I'm not aware of anything going on specifically in Scotland. There is a Scotland Stoics group that meets sometimes. I don't think there's a conference in Scotland, but there are events sometimes that happen in England, in London, for example. Mm-hmm. So if people search online, maybe go to the Modern Stoicism website, they might find information about events that are happening in their area.
Right. Amazing. Thank you so much for accepting to take part in this conversation, Donald. Hope we can do this again soon.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.